many low church Protestant preachers would not take on. It's part of the lectionary lesson, however, in other traditions, Episcopal, Catholic, Lutheran are all engaging this particular part of the book of Job today. But, we're the Free Church Protestants in the United Church of Christ. Your preacher can choose anything she wants to preach on. However, the lectionary is a good discipline. And sometimes your preacher needs discipline. So we are going to engage the book of Job over the next few Sundays. That may seem like a very odd choice in this particular time in human life, in the affairs of the nation, all kinds of things. But Job is a book that we need to understand because it's one that has been so misinterpreted, misquoted, misused for thousands of years. And so my hope is over the next 4 Sundays, we'll have a chance to engage this book. It's one of the longest in the Bible. It's over 30 chapters long. We'll have a chance to engage this book and maybe crack it open a bit, at least to dispel perhaps some of the misunderstandings and also find what it offers us. Now, I'm in good company when I say that Job is a book that's often been misquoted and misunderstood. In fact, the Bible itself misquotes Job. The book of James in Christian scripture talks about the patience of Job. Job was not patient. Don't let anybody tell you that. He may have started out that way, but by the time his third friend begins to tell him why it is he's suffering, he is not patient. We'll get into that next week. This week, I want us just to explore the very first chapter of Job. Don't worry, we're not going to spend the next 36 weeks going chapter by chapter through this book. But the very first chapter is one that really sets the stage, in a way. And the very first chapter is an odd way to begin any book of the Bible, because it begins like a fairy tale. Once there was a man, once upon a time. It's not set in history. It doesn't list a number of kings. It doesn't tell where it really is. It is an ancient story. And we don't get the end of that ancient story till 30 some odd chapters later. Because in the middle of the story are 36 chapters, most of which are Job's friends telling him why the calamitous things have happened to him. And his response to their, quote, good advice. And then the next to the last 3 chapters of the book of Job, God's answer to Job isn't out of wisdom literature. It's not out of storytelling. It's straight from the book of Genesis, the creation story. So in reading Job, it's a book that combines at least 3 different kinds of literature. Storytelling, theological, pastoral understandings, sort of, and then the book of Genesis, and then the end of the fairy tale story. Fasten your seatbelts. So let's engage the first chapter of the book of Job. And I was going to have the congregation be either God or Satan or Job, but I decided no. So Ben and I will offer this sort of antiphonally.
Once there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did.
One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also was among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well. All that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing.
God moves in a mysterious way, we just sang. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons is in front of a church. Congregation is coming out. Pastor, who happens to be male, is in his black robe. There's a couple that come through the line, and the husband's shaking the minister's hand and says, "I know God moves in a mysterious way, but if I were that mysterious, I'd get fired." I think Job could relate to that. Could definitely relate to that. What do we do with this once upon a time story? A story that leads to incredible suffering. Did you hear it? Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times somebody comes to Job and tells him about the new calamity that has befallen him and his camels and his children and his land and his servants and the whole enchilada. What do we do with this story? That in a way sounds a little bit almost like some kind of very grim fairy tale. And what do we do with this story when all those things that befell Job are befalling people in our own time? Did you hear about the big wind? Did you hear about the buildings that are falling on people because of bombs? Do you know anybody in your own life who in the last 6 months has lost a family member? Or perhaps you yourself have lost such a person? What do we do with this story? What do we do with it? And especially, what do we do with the middle of the story of the chapter 1? The chapter begins with talking about how Job is so blameless and righteous, and also that he has 3,000 camels and 700 sheep and a gazillion servants. I mean, this guy is, Elon Musk, move over. This guy is doing well by himself. And then the focus shifts from the earth up to the heavenly court, to a king's court. Because thousands of years ago, that is one of the ways that people imagined where God lived. And also imagined that God was not just an amorphous being, mystery, whatever, but that God was the king. The king. And so please excuse me if I happen in this sermon to launch into he, him pronouns describing God. You all should know me well enough to know that I don't think God has a gender. But in this story, God did, which is just fine with me. Because I'd rather have God be he in this one than she, okay? So God is the king. And the royal court is coming in, including angels and fallen angels, like Satan. And Satan says to God, I've been going around to and fro on the earth. And God gets a bit puffed up. Well, in all of your going around to and fro on the earth, have you considered my servant Job? If God had lapels, he would have his thumbs behind them. Have you considered my servant Job? He's blameless. He's righteous. He's so righteous that not only does he atone for his own misdeeds or possible sins, he makes sacrifices and atones for the sins of his children. Now think about that, any of you who have children or grandchildren. Job is covering all of his theological, spiritual bases. And God is very proud of that. Consider my servant Job. But then Satan sort of wiggles in and gets to God's ego and says, well, why wouldn't he be blameless? Why wouldn't he be righteous? Why wouldn't he always worship you? He's at the top of the food chain. He doesn't have a care in the world, financially or any other way. But you take all that away, God. Take down the fence that protects him, and he will curse you to your face. And God gets snookered. God goes along with that. It's in the story that Ben just read. God lets God's self be snookered by the devil himself. See, himself, God, devil, it's okay. At least in my book. Herself. God gets tricked and makes a deal with the devil. What in God's name are we supposed to do with this story? Why is it even in the Bible? If I'd been writing the Bible, I would have left it out. I mean, yes, maybe included the part about a man, a wealthy, good, righteous man who has all kinds of calamities. That I would have left in. But not this part about God getting tricked by the devil. What kind of story is this? What do we do with it? Why is it even in there? For me, that's the real question of how the book of Job begins. I'd like to put forward to you today 2 reasons why it's in there. The first reason is that the Bible tells the truth. And it records how people understood God at work in this world over eons. Because there are times in human history when people have regarded this mystery called God as simply an expanded human being. Think of the Greek gods, the Roman gods. They're always bickering and tricking one another, and they're also always bickering and tricking human beings. Human beings in Greek and Roman mythology are always getting caught in the snares of the gods and goddesses. This story originated in that same kind of milieu of people, at least at that time, but I would say even in our time, anthropomorphizing God to look like us. To look like us. The Bible tells the truth. It also doesn't stop with that first chapter of Job. But it's in there. And I do appreciate that truth-telling. It doesn't gloss things over. It doesn't gussy it up. It says this is what people believed about God then and perhaps even now. The second thing, however, this opening of this book tells me is that some of the things I learned, perhaps you learned, some of the things that are extreme within Christianity, within Judaism, within Islam, within all different kinds of traditions, within New Age thought, that everything happens for a reason. Have you ever heard that? Everything happens for a reason. Kate Bowler, who is a professor of church history at Duke University, that was the theology she grew up with. And that was the theology she also explored in her groundbreaking work as a historian on the prosperity gospel. Ever heard of that? That's if you just pray enough, do the right things, think the right thoughts, whether you're coming at it from a Christian standpoint or a New Age standpoint. If you do all those things, abracadabra, your life will be hunky-dory. Prosperity Gospel. Award-winning book. But then at age 35, married and with a 4-year-old, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And all that theology that she had grown up with about God never gives you more than you can handle. Everything happens for a reason. All things work for good. If you just pray enough, if you just hope enough, if you just have enough faith, things will be okay. My friends, I believe this story about God getting tricked by Satan is in the Bible to undercut all of that theology. Because there is no good reason other than the fact that God got snookered by Satan for all of these calamities to happen to Job. The only purpose for Job to lose his cattle, his camels, his sheep, his land, his servants, his children, and ultimately his own health, the only reason for that is this bet between God and the devil. The deal. This is an art of the deal story, my friends. And it's in there. It's in there. Because I believe it lays to rest all of those other theologies about everything happening for a reason. Because I would be lying 6 days to Sunday if I ever told you that. As a pastor, as a Christian, and as a fellow traveler. Because you and I both know that there are things that happen for no good reason other than human greed, other than human fear, other than human dishonesty, all those kinds of things we cannot lay on God are human actions. And we do people a disservice if we have a theology that says, well, if you just prayed enough, everything would be okay. Because you and I know people, and perhaps we ourselves, who have prayed and prayed and prayed for a loved one to live, for a war to end, for people not to be oppressed by poverty or by race or by hatred. And it still happens. This story lays to rest that theology. And it says, at least to me, there are things we cannot explain. Bad things happen to good people. And a friend of mine says, the thing that really bothers her is that good things happen to bad people. Either way, don't lay it on God. Don't lay it on God. But what is this story doing there? Well, we also have to understand that, as I said, this is an ancient story, probably coming out of the oral tradition, not somebody who sat down and wrote the book of Job. But at least the first part, the once upon a time first couple of chapters, are ones that come out of sitting around the campfire, or a parent trying to explain something to a child, all those kinds of stories. And in typical storytelling fashion, especially within the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew rhetoric, it takes things to the extreme. It's not just enough that Job loses his servants. It's then the next calamity, then the next calamity, then the next calamity, and I alone am left to tell the tale. That is a very common kind of literary technique, if you will, storytelling technique of exaggeration. It's in that book. It's in that the way that story is being told. And I also think that the way in which Satan and God interact with each other, that's another. It's part of the technique is taking things to the absolutely absurd place. I can guarantee you there is not any Jewish person I know who would ever attribute to the mystery of the universe, creator of heaven and earth, the one whose name shall not be spoken, that great ultimate giver of life, the kind of God we find in this opening part of Job. It's a way of making it so absurd that we don't have to believe in that kind of God. In fact, it says this isn't the God we really believe in. And we learn that by the end of the book of Job. But it's taking things to the extreme. exaggeration. Jesus did it all the time. And so in the truth of the story, in that very first chapter, and I'm not going to tie this all up neatly. You've got to come back for the next 3 or 4 Sundays. But in this very first chapter, I believe it lays to rest that unhelpful theology of everything happens for a reason. Or, as we'll find later in Job, it happens because we've sinned, or the person has sinned, or because they don't have enough faith, or we haven't prayed hard enough. You cannot read, in my book, the first chapter of Job and hang on to that theology. Because maybe bad things happen to me because of my sin, but that ain't Job. Maybe things happen for some kind of reason that I don't know, but that's not Job's story. We know the reason, and it's crazy. The God in whom we have our trust is not the eternal vivisector who goes around doing people in order to show how powerful God is. The God in whom we have our trust is not the one up in heaven who doesn't understand human suffering. It's the one who took on human form and human life, and therefore human suffering. The God in whom at least I trust is not the one who makes everything hunky-dory all the time, but who will be there in the shadows, in the valleys, in the hurt, in the misunderstandings, in the confusion of our lives and of our time. I think that's the God I want to preach. And I put it before you that it might be the God we want to believe in. Thanks be to God. Amen.